Psalm 22. If you want to turn there, is where we'll be starting, Psalm 22. So one announcement is just my thanks for those who filled in the past couple of weeks. I know Josh had already planned to do the lesson. I'm sorry I missed that, but the week before that, I don't even know who preached in my absence, but thank you, Earl. And sometimes when things happen, there's not a lot of control over events, and I appreciate those who are willing to step up. Jeffy asked me to express to the congregation her thanks for, as she says, for cards, letters, texts, thoughts, and prayers. All are so appreciated. We are hanging in there and jumping through the hoops of things that need to get done, and they miss us. So please keep that in mind, or keep them in mind as they deal with the passing of her father. I think that's all the announcements that I had. So it used to be that it was pretty easy to see, like if you watched old-time westerns or movies from the Dark Ages, executions were one of those moments that people would gather for. Let's come together and all watch someone die or lose their head in some way. And amazingly, the Roman government at the time of Jesus made sure that, in fact, executions were something that people wanted to see. And so it's really not surprising that in the scriptures, the death of Jesus is called a spectacle. Something that people came to see. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, I think, in part because it was prophesied in Psalm, the 22nd chapter, verses 16 through 18. It says, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. They stare and gloat over me." They stare and they gloat over me. He's surrounded by these evildoers, and they're just enjoying, is that the right word? Watching the spectacle of the death of Jesus at that time. In fact, if you turn to Luke, the 23rd chapter, and in verse 35, we'll be spending most of our time now in the Gospels that have to do with the death of Jesus. So Luke, the 23rd chapter, and in verse 35, it says about the people stood by watching. They were just watching that thing. In verse 48, it goes on, all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. I think it's hard for us when we think about the death of our Lord Jesus Christ to think of it as a spectacle. It wasn't entertainment, but it was clearly something that was there to be seen. And there are a lot of different perspectives that we are given in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, about what was seen at that time. And I think it's worth our time to go through and look at the things that people saw. Because the better that we see, the better we're going to understand. And the reason for that is the more we understand, the better we can glory in the cross. What did they see when Jesus was crucified? We're going to start with Pilate. So in John, the 18th chapter, in verse 36, actually, this goes before the death of Jesus. Jesus and Pilate are having, I wanted to say conversation, but it was an interrogation that they were having. And you recall that Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." And Pilate said, "So you are a king?" And Jesus said, "That's what you say," which is kind of a way of saying, "Yeah, I am." But then as the interrogation continued, we find 3 times that Pilate says, "I find no guilt in him." You'll see it in verse 38, in the 19th chapter in verse 4, in the 19th chapter in verse 6. he would say repeatedly to different groups of people, I find no guilt in this man. And he presents Jesus to the Jews. And he says to them, behold your king. And how did the Jews respond? Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him. And Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? It's interesting. It really seems that he caught on to that idea of Jesus being the king. And that's interesting because someone claiming to be king in front of a Roman government ruler, that was treason, that was rebellion. And to say, I find no guilt in him, and keep referring him to the king, Pilate saw something there, didn't he? And so when Jesus is taken away to be crucified, in John the 19th chapter, we read that he put an inscription on the cross. And it said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, how did the Jews react to that? There it is, written up, and we're told it's written in 3 languages. It's written in Aramaic, which was common for the Hebrews. It was written in Greek. It was written in Latin. Many of the Jews read the inscription. Sorry, it was Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. I got that wrong. Sorry. So the chief priests come to Pilate and they say, don't write he's the king of the Jews. Rather say, he said I'm the king of the Jews. And Pilate said what? I have written what I've written. Pilate saw something in Jesus, didn't he? He saw something in Jesus that the Jews who had been looking for the Messiah to come, who had been looking for the Christ to come, Pilate saw something in Jesus that they didn't recognize, that they refused to recognize, the majority of them. He not only saw his innocence, but he saw his majesty.
I know.
It's the starting route. We're headed east on Bad Patton.
I'm sorry, that was done by mistake. I apologize.
It's okay. We all need to be planning which restaurant we're going to and get the bread.
No, no. I
Sorry.
won't put it down.
Maybe what Pilate saw in Jesus, and I hope this is true, he saw the best of the Jews. Here's your king. He said it over and over again. The Roman soldiers were also at the cross. You can keep reading in John the 19th chapter, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, what did they do? They took his garments, they divided the garments into parts, one part for each soldier in the tunic, and then they cast lots for the one that was really nice. And that was to fulfill prophecy. But when those soldiers were at that moment dividing the garments, what did they see? This is part of the spectacle. Can you imagine at the cross seeing the soldiers gambling? Who's going to get this? Did they just see this as another day, another time for personal gain? This is just the way things go. We're crucifying these criminals. At this point, this was ordinary. And I think that's important for us to realize from what we see later about how ordinary it was to them. In Mark the 15th chapter, and in verse 29 through 30, it talks about those who would pass by. And it says those who were passing by were wagging their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself or come down from the cross." What do you hear there by the passers-by? It's just the joy of mocking. Seeing someone who's suffering and just mocking him. They don't see this in any way that's meaningful. And really, they don't see any way that Jesus could escape, do they? How do you escape being nailed to boards? This was, for them, just mocking. And the Jewish leaders joined in that. In Mark the 15th chapter, verses 31 and 32, the chief priest would cry out, "He saved others." And of course, they don't mean that. We have to understand, they're mocking even at that point when they say he saved others. He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. What did they say they're going to do if he comes down from the cross? Oh, if we see that, we'll believe it. Had Jesus given plenty of signs? Had he shown that they could believe him? This is one of the things that always amazes me. In John the 3rd chapter, not long after Jesus started his ministry, Nicodemus comes to him and says, "No one can do these signs unless they're from God." At the very beginning, Nicodemus recognized those signs had meaning. Oh no, if you come down from the cross, and again, he's nailed to the cross. If you come down from the cross, then we'll see and we'll believe. Did you notice how they use Jesus' words against him? And they're mocking him to each other. For them, it's just making fun of it. They make fun of the idea of salvation. Oh, he saved others. They're mocking the idea of him being a king. How ironic. With Pilate having recognized something there, they're mocking the very idea of belief, aren't they? Then we'll see and we'll believe. These are the ones who were supposed to know, who were familiar with the scriptures, who understood, should have understood about the Messiah and the King and everything, and they're mocking. And we're told in Luke, the 23rd chapter, that even the criminals mocked him. On each side of Jesus were crucified with him were robbers. And one of them would say to him, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." I find it odd that, you're dying the same way that another guy is and you mock him at that moment. It feels awkward. It feels not real, but he actually, and I think this gives us a picture of how prevalent the mocking was of Jesus as he died there on the cross. That even this man dying on the cross with him was mocking him also. That he joined in with that. The other, of course, rebuked. Again, what a weird way to have a conversation. "Do you not fear God?" the other robber said. "Since you're under the same sentence of condemnation, we're here justly," he says, "for the reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Wait a minute. How did he know? How did he know that Jesus had done nothing wrong? What did he see at that moment, at that time, that he understood who Jesus was? He's done nothing wrong. That robber dying with him on the cross, one mocks, one sees an innocent man. And I don't know how he knew, but he saw something. And so he turned to Jesus and he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." I feel like that was a conversation maybe not many people got to hear. And yet we do. Here's someone who not only believes that Jesus is the king, but looks forward to the kingdom. And Jesus gives him that great promise. Today you'll be with me in paradise. He saw salvation. He saw it through Jesus. What an incredible picture. The women were also there. For this, we go back to John, the 19th chapter. We're told a whole list of women, most of them named Mary, it seems like. And they were there at the cross, and it included Jesus' mother, who stood near him. And at that time, Jesus calls out, "Woman, behold your son," indicating to John, probably the disciple. He said, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, John took Mary into her house. What did these women see when they were looking? What were they seeing at that moment? Maybe more importantly, what did the other people see when Jesus tries to find a solution for taking care of his mother? I mean, that's love, isn't it? Those who love Jesus are nearby. Jesus' love for his mother and caring for her. That had to be touching that moment. And then we're told about more bystanders in Matthew, that were there at that time, Matthew the 27th chapter. After the 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And someone, we're told in verse 47, the bystanders hearing that said, he's calling out for Elijah. Now, in part, that's because, my God, why have you forsaken me? As Jesus has recorded, it says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which Eli sounds like the beginning of Elijah, doesn't it? And others took a sponge and they took it to him. Others said, well, let's wait and see if Elijah shows up. This passage always puzzled me. It's kind of weird. Jesus cries out with a loud voice and he dies. But I think I've come to understand that these bystanders are still mocking. The prophecy was in the Old Testament, the book of Malachi ends with this, is that Elijah was to precede the coming of the Messiah. So here's this one up on the cross who's claiming his Messiah. Jesus is now dying, and he's pleading, Elijah, come and prove that I am the Messiah. And to them, they heard the cry of a desperate fraud, and they mocked him. I don't know. That takes a lot of scriptural reasoning. But maybe even at that moment, when they're hearing Jesus call out the scriptures, they're still mocking. And then the centurion. The centurion is the one that really turns us around for us, isn't it? The centurion who in the book of Mark, when he saw all the things that happened in Mark, the 15th chapter, verse 39 says, truly this man was the Son of God. And I think it's in Luke that he says, truly certainly this man was innocent. So he at least saw that. Whichever way you take it, that centurion, and I have no doubt that he knew what was going on with the gambling for the clothes. By the end of this, it's all changed for him. He saw something incredible there. And as we read already in Luke 23, whatever the people had come to see for this spectacle, how did they leave? Luke 23 verse 48 says they returned home beating their breasts, which is an expression of extreme sorrow. Maybe it's not ours anymore, but it was theirs. What they had come to see was an event. What they saw was something that they didn't expect. They saw the death of the King of the Jews, the Messiah, the one who had come to save them. And so they went home doing that. The problem with any kind of spectacle is that so often we get caught up in the moment of what's happening that we forget to see the importance and the meaning of those events. So as we go through and we look at the spectacle of the cross and we strive to understand, I think each of us needs to ask ourselves the question, what do I see when I look at the cross? What do I see when I see Jesus die? And that's, I want to tell you, four things that I see. And the first is kind of ironic. I see the one who is life dying. Jesus had just told his disciples a few days before this in John the 14th chapter, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Later, the Apostle Paul would remind us that he alone has immortality. And here is this one who is the life, and he alone has immortality. And in Acts, the 3rd chapter, Peter would call him the author of life. In fact, the way that he says it to the Jews at that time, when they talk about putting Jesus on the cross, they say, but you denied the holy and righteous one and asked for a murder to be granted him, and you killed the author of life. You killed the author of life. I mean, he goes on to say, whom God raised from the dead, which is a really important point. But the irony of saying you killed the author of life. So we see, as I see, as I look at the cross, this one who is immortal, the one who is life, and who offers us life. This one who is the everlasting and the eternal. The one who has always been. The one who is life dies. I see the light shining in darkness. In John the 8th chapter, Jesus would speak to the Jews and he would say, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Here's the one, that's a bold thing to say to people. I'm the light of the world? What kind of ego is that, unless it's true? Unless it's real. If you believe in me, you don't ever have to walk in darkness again. In John the 12th chapter, verse 46, he says, I've come into the world as a light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. So here is the light at that time on the cross. Do you remember what happened when he went up on the mountain with James and John and Peter? He was transfigured before them. The glory was so bright they couldn't even look. They saw that light. They saw that majesty. And Peter would write about it later when he said, we saw the glorious majesty. The light, the one whose glory that we can't behold, is now surrounded by darkness. The sun doesn't shine for 3 hours. And what do we see that one who is light doing in the darkness? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The light is shining, even at that. Those who reviled him, Peter reminds us he didn't revile them back. The light was shining at that moment. When he's mocked by one, but another speaks to him about the kingdom, he says, you're going to be with me there. There's the light looking forward to the kingdom and looking forward to paradise. We see him caring for his mother. We see him crying out to his father. We hear him say, it is finished. And I think he's talking about the plan of salvation. It is finished. Do you see the light shining in the darkness? That's why Paul later in Colossians, the first chapter, verse 13, would say he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. That's the light. I see the one who called himself the Good Shepherd being the Passover lamb. In John the 10th chapter, verse 10 and 11, he called himself the Good Shepherd. He said, I have come that they may have life and they may have it abundantly. I'm the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. And that's exactly what had been prophesied by Isaiah, isn't it? Isaiah 53, verse 7. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that is before its shears is silent, so he opened out his mouth. Here is the Good Shepherd. The one who's promised us life, and not just life, but an abundant life. That he's going to care for us. He sacrificed as of a lamb without blemish. It's Paul who in 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter and verse 7, says that Christ, our Passover lamb, has been slain. And it's Peter in 1 Peter 1, verses 18 and 19, who says, knowing that you were ransomed from your futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver and with gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without spot or blemish. He's the lamb, and he's the Good Shepherd. And that's how he shows he's the Good shepherd is that he was willing to die for us. And finally, I see loving. I'm not very clever. That's not the best way to say it. But I see loving on the cross. Greater love has no one than this. That someone lay down his life for his friends. Romans, the 5th chapter. But God demonstrates his own love for us. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And just to be clear about that love that he talks about, he loves us not because we're worth loving. He loves us when we are, as the passage says, weak and ungodly, and we are still sinners and we are his enemies. But God demonstrates his love. And then he says in Romans 5, verse 10, for while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. Much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. I see love rejected by hatred and by envy, mocked and reviled, and scorned and ridiculed. And he doesn't respond to them. And I see love doing what he had come to do all along. That all along what he was doing, what he knew was going to happen. And he talked about it to his disciples, and he talked about it to the Jews, that he was going to Jerusalem and he was going to die. He knew all of this was going to happen. And I see the Holy Son of God loving you so much that he wants to reunite you with your Father. And he dies to make that possible. I see love and loving. While some are going to look at the cross and see only the obvious things, I think we need to take time to look more deeply at the cross and see that there's so much more happening that day. That this spectacle is something that we need to see what it means to our own lives each and every day. And we take time to really look. We are going to see the glory of the cross, and we're only going to boast in the glory of the cross. What do you see when you look there? Jesus at one point said in John 12 and verse 38, and when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And isn't that part of what we see him doing? As he's dying on the crosses, he's drawing all people to him. And that's the invitation for each and every one of us today. That any of us can draw near to God, our Father, to Jesus, who's drawing us to him so that he can give us that life, that love, that light. If you're not a child of God at this point and you would like to use this opportunity because you believe in him, all the things are ready. You can believe in him and repent and be baptized, and you can have that hope of heaven, that chance to be with him, just like the guy on the cross. And if you're a brother or sister in Christ, perhaps you need our prayers and help for some reason, please let that be made known as we stand and sing. I serve